Kids. I've worked on this story off and on for several months. Actually, I haven't worked on it in several months. There's just too much of it, so I'm going to break it into two parts. Part 1 today, part 2 next Friday. Grab a snack, a blankie, all your pets, sit back on the couch, and take it all in. And then y'all come back now next week. You hear? June 25th, 1906. The crime. Harry Kendall Thaw shot and killed Stanford White on the Madison Square Garden roof in New York City in the evening during a theater production of Mamselle Champagne. He fired 3 shots at Stanford from a short range. All bullets hit Stanford, and he died instantly. Harry disengaged the revolver and calmly headed to an exit, where he was met by a fireman who took the gun from him, and Harry was arrested by the police. Harry is in the Tombs prison in New York as of June 26th in the morning, held without bail. Okay, great. I hope you enjoyed the story. Yeah, I wish it was that fast. Who is Harry Kendall Thaw, the murderer? He is about 35 years old, married to 20-year-old Evelyn Nesbitt Thaw, who was an actress and artist model. They used to live in Pittsburgh, but moved recently to New York City. Harry's got some money, inherited from his father's estate when his father passed, earns from that inheritance about $80,000 per year in 1906 times. His father had been a railroad tycoon. Harry attended what is now known as the University of Pittsburgh, but left school after his father's death when he came upon his inheritance. His family, in general, is considered well-to-do. He and Evelyn met in 1901. In 1903, he went to Evelyn's mother to say that he wanted to marry Evelyn if she'd have him. Evelyn had acute appendicitis, and after the operation, her mother was going to take her to Europe for convalescence, and he could go with them. He proposed June 1903. Evelyn refused. Why? Well, that major tidbit of scandalous information is coming later. Obviously, she would eventually marry Harry. Throughout the story, you will hear me refer to him as Harry or Thaw, just FYI. Who is Stanford White, the deceased? Stanford was at this time about 53 years old, married with children. He was educated at New York University with a Master of Arts. Studied architecture with Charles D. Gambrell and H. Richardson, chief assistant to Richardson in the construction of the Trinity Church in Boston. He was part of the formation of the architecture firm of McKim, Mead, and White, who were well known for their buildings. Son of an American Shakespearean scholar and linguistic critic. He designed Madison Square Garden, the second version, not what you see as MSG today. The buildings of the Century and Metropolitan Clubs, the Washington Arch, the new, at this time, buildings of the University of Virginia and those of NYU, and the pedestals for the principal statues of St. Gaudens. Other architects, though, would say Stanford was more artist than architect. He had an apartment for some years in the tower of the MSG, and as an avid lover of the theater, would invite people over. Wow, Tiaman, you said that in a rather vampy tone. Oh, did I? Throughout this story, you will hear him referred to as Stanford or White. Where did it happen? As mentioned, the murder took place on the roof garden of the famed Madison Square Garden, which Stanford was the architect of. Now, as I said, this MSG is not your present MSG, which opened in 1968. This iteration of MSG is the second version of the garden, which was opened from 1890 to 1925 and had a cool aforementioned tower. There was a third version of the garden between about 1925 and 1968, and then in 1968, the version you know now. Why did it happen? Well, we'll get to that. Let's just say for the time being that the two men were not strangers, and Stanford was no stranger to Evelyn. Oh, geez, Taman, is this about a girl again? Yeah, of course. Isn't it usually? Harry's ride to the jail entrance had drawn quite a crowd of onlookers. This is 1906. How on earth did people already know what Thaw had done, had known what time he would be paraded about in a carriage/wagon to these police spots? I don't know, but they did. Crowds became so large that the police had to call out for extra personnel for crowd control. Harry arrived at the jail entrance, spoke with a couple of lawyers and an old friend, Burr McIntosh. Don't bother keeping track of his lawyers. He will have many by the time this story ends. His lawyer told Harry to keep his trap shut and that if anything was to be said, it would be the lawyers speaking. Harry was arraigned and was told that he be remanded to the coroner's custody. Harry said he was feeling peckish. The police captain sent a messenger over to a nearby restaurant and was brought a tray with 2 peaches, 2 bread slices, a bowl of milk, and a cup of coffee. Harry ate, and in the meantime, yet another lawyer arrived named Louis Delafield, brother to one of the other lawyers, Frank. Delafield was overheard saying to Harry, quote, "There seems to be some doubt as to whether you think you shot White," end quote. Harry responded, but no one nearby understood what he said, and then Harry was taken to the coroner's office. Lawyer Delafield took over here, Assistant DA arrived, and Thaw was arraigned in front of the coroner after a patrolman gave his affidavit who got his information from a few people, like Warren Faxton, chief engineer of the Madison Square Garden, Lionel Lawrence, manager of the company that was giving the performance that night, Edward Convey, Harry Rubenstein, and Dr. Pesciu, who examined White's body after the shooting. Harry was taken to the prison, examined by a prison physician, and left to his cell on the second tier of the prison where other murderers are held. Already it's assumed that he will plead insanity, said one of his representatives. Quote, "There can be no doubt that Thaw was and is hopelessly insane, and that the commission in lunacy, yes, that was a real thing, will report him so," end quote. So, how did we get to this point? Well, for now, we're just going to touch on that evening in particular's events, just prior to the shooting. Stanford had dinner at the Cafe Martin with Stanford's son Lawrence and a friend of Lawrence's, both about college age. Stanford had bought tickets to a theater production at MSG and invited his son and friend, who had to beg off as they already had tickets for another event. Who else was at the cafe? Harry and Evelyn Thaw, plus her father and another man, were dining. Harry was oblivious at Stanford's presence at the cafe until Evelyn pointed it out. Stanford bid his party adieu and eventually went up to the garden for the opening night of the play Mamselle Champagne, along with 1,000 other attendees. Stanford mainly sat alone, although various people would stop by his table for a quick chat. As we already know, Harry and Evelyn were also there. Evelyn went backstage to see some friends, and Harry started to become agitated. Stanford came into the sitting area, spoke with a friend, the friend left, and then Stanford looked at the stage. Harry saw him. Allegedly, there was eye contact, and Stanford supposedly glared at Harry. Harry made his way to him as Harry's party was leaving during the second act. Eyes on the prize, not stopping, not paying much attention to anyone else until he reached Stanford's table and leaned over it and shot him face front. The first shot went through Stanford's eye, and that was all she wrote. Not contented, Harry shot again through Stanford's mouth and then through the left shoulder. Stanford's already deceased body fell to the floor. Stanford's son Lawrence, who had dinner earlier that evening with his father, had said that his father was in the best of spirits at their dinner earlier that evening and didn't intimate there was any trouble. Evelyn, the alleged murderer's wife, is assumed will be called in to provide some information. She disappeared after the murder. "What will the defense be?" Lawyer O'Reilly was asked. Quote, "Why, the man is crazy, of course, mad as a March hare," end quote. Quote, "What about the story alleged to have been told by his wife about White?" End quote. Quote, "All hallucinations, every one, nothing in it at all." End quote. Quote, "Then he shot an innocent man?" End quote. Quote, "Yes, just as any crazy man would do." End quote. Policeman Harry Debs, the arresting officer, gave his account. Quote, "I found the people almost crazy, trying to get out of the place. I jumped into the mob and saw a woman lying down. She had fainted, and then I saw White. I said to Thaw, 'Did you do it?' And he replied, 'Yes, I did it. That man ruined my life.' Or wife. I don't know which he said, but it sounded like that. Then he went on saying, 'That man ruined my home. I guess he won't ruin any more homes. Is he dead?' I told him he was, and he said, Damn glad of it. And he was glad, quote, that he had made a good job of it. When I arrested Thaw, a woman who manager Lionel Lawrence told me was Mrs. Thaw, rushed up to Thaw and kissed him and said, I did not think you'd do it in that way. It's all right, Thaw told her. Then she whispered something in his ear. I don't know what she said to him. Down in the hall and in the street, a lot of women gathered about us and shook hands with Thaw and sympathized with him. Why did you do it? Why did you do it? They kept saying, end quote. Now, already people are not altogether surprised. Friends of the two men have known for some time now that there was some bad juju between the two. What could have brought about that bad feeling? Architecture? Being rich? A lady? Well, now, as we already know, people murder for all kinds of reasons. Rewinding a bit. Evelyn, when she was still Miss Nesbit and unmarried, had come to New York with her mom, and Mr. White was a friend. Evelyn was a mere 16 then, but wanted to get on the stage, and Mr. White gave her assistance, showing a theater man some pictures of her posing when she was an artist's model. She was in the production, The Wild Rose, and did well, and was often seen with Mr. White, where after shows he would take her and her chaperone to restaurants. Her mom was quite taken with Mr. White and all he had done for her daughter, and would allow her daughter to be alone with Mr. White, which was a huge mistake, allegedly. Inasmuch as Stanford had a reputation as a nice guy, he also had a reputation as a lech. That super cool tower he lived in? Home to some alleged lechery. The movie The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing from the 1950s, which I have not seen yet, was kind of loosely based on this crime story. Yes, Stanford had a red velvet swing in his tower. George Lederer, manager of the Colonial Theater, said, quote, White was one of the finest men that ever lived. He became interested in Miss Nesbit when she was playing in Florodora and tried to help her when he knew what a struggle she and her mother were having to get along. I know of many cases where White had aided young people striving to obtain a foothold on the stage. He was a most kindly, generous man, end quote. A statement said to have been made by Harry when, I don't know, or if this is even true. Quote, we were all at a party in Martin's. This was the dinner before the garden show. You can find out the names of the others there, but I was sitting some distance from my wife. Suddenly I saw her get very pale and begin to shiver, and I thought she was ill. I made a motion to inquire what was the matter, and she called a waiter and wrote a note, which she sent round the table to me. The note said, the dirty blackguard is here. Then I turned and saw that fat scoundrel sitting there, big and healthy, and then I saw her and how she was, end quote. He was asked, did White make any motion to attack you, end quote. What? Said Thaw. The question was repeated. Thaw nodded his head in the affirmative. In addition to the revolver found on his person, Harry had $158 in cash, blank checks, and a gold cigarette case. Evelyn's ma was told of what her son-in-law was alleged to have done. She said little, claiming not to have known Mr. White or known what this matter could have been about. Harry's ma is out on an ocean liner and they are trying to get a hold of her by wireless before she gets to London and reads about it through the press. And Miss Roberts was seated near to White. Quote, we were seated but 2 tables away. We noticed Mr. White come in and Mr. Webster, who's a song composer, recognized him and told me who he was. He bowed to some friends or acquaintances, and then the other man, who I learned was Mr. Stevens, sat down and talked with him a few minutes. They laughed and joked, and the other man left Mr. White after shaking hands. Mr. White then leaned on his hand and laughed heartily at a joke from the stage. I saw Thaw walk out. His coat collar was turned up, and he kept his right hand in his buttoned coat. I didn't know what on earth he was going to do when he stared about the place. He looked like a ghost. He was so pale. He walked slowly but directly towards Mr. White. Just as he got to him, he pulled out his hand suddenly from his coat. I saw something shine, but before I had time even to scream, he fired 3 times directly at Mr. White, just as fast as he could. Mr. White didn't utter a sound, but fell sideways off the chair, lying in a heap on the floor. His face was underneath, but the blood began to run to a stream down the floor, and then we all knew that there had been a crime committed. Thaw walked away slowly and calmly, and then the crowd closed in. I never heard of a more cool or brutal thing in my life. Mr. White had absolutely no chance to defend himself in any way. Not a word was spoken, and Mr. White was given no chance to say anything or do anything. He was shot down in cold blood. If I had had a revolver, I would gladly have killed the man who did such a deed." End quote. Evelyn Thaw has finally been found at the Cambridge Court Hotel, where she had been escorted there by George Carnegie, brother-in-law of Harry. George's wife is Harry's sister. Evelyn's been subpoenaed. Agnes Palmer, actress. Quote, "I was ill in a hospital 2 weeks ago when Stanford White came to see me. He told me that Harry Thaw had threatened to kill him and that he knew that Thaw was carrying a pistol. I advised him to have Thaw arrested. Mr. White said to me, quote, 'Oh, Thaw is crazy. He is a dope fiend. He lives on the stuff. He won't hurt anybody. I don't fear him.'" End quote. Fletcher Norton, actor. He stopped to chat with a couple. Harry acted weird and left the table to go smoke. Evelyn told Fletcher, quote, "For heaven's sake, Fletcher, leave this place. My husband is crazy with jealousy lately. He goes up in the air every time I look at any of my old men friends. If you stay here, I won't answer for the consequences." End quote. However, the restaurant where this took place says false. Harry hadn't been there in some time after he had been ejected for disorderly conduct. However, Stanford wasn't innocent, according to some, as we've already mentioned. Said one cabman, quote, "I knew that fellow would be killed sooner or later, but I thought that it would be a father that would do it, not a husband." End quote. An actress that knew the couple said, quote, "I heard Harry Thaw nearly 2 years ago while in a restaurant say, 'I will kill him.'" He meant Stanford White. There wasn't much attention paid to the remark at the time, but Thaw evidently had a mania on the subject and was only waiting for a good opportunity. He had threatened to kill Mr. White several times since then. It is my belief that Mrs. Thaw was instrumental in having Harry shoot Mr. White. I have heard her often accuse Mr. White of the facts now charged against him. She would say this in front of her husband, and even in public places, with strange men about. She has said the same thing. It was disgusting to us who knew it was not true. I have been her friend for many years, but I am very bitter against her now. I believe she told Thaw that charge against Mr. White in order to justify herself. I remember about a month after Evelyn Nesbit and Harry Thaw were married that Mr. White called on me. He told me he had met them in the restaurant of the Hotel St. Regis. He said that Mrs. Thaw averted her head and would not look at him, not even to bow. He felt hurt at the snub and told me about it. End quote. June 28th. Harry refuses to plead insanity. He says it's justifiable homicide. Shockingly, and a weird coincidence, White was supposed to have left June 28th to sail for Europe. The Thaws were supposed to have gone on the same ship. So apparently, aside from Harry saying he won't plead insanity, well, the DA's alienists are saying he's sane and that he is as hard-headed as a goat and could not give them anything. Even though his own counsel told him he should be examined, etc., Harry said absolutely not. And this is why he won't plead insanity, because he doesn't have the backup. Thaw, though accused of being a morphine fiend and liquor lover, he has not asked for either since his cell stay. Also, new news, apparently Evelyn gave Harry's attorney, Alcott, a stack of letters from Stanford. One of them as recent as 2 weeks ago. Some of the letters were apparently obscene. Evelyn had hid them from her husband. It's thought that he may have found them. Alcott refuses to divulge them, but does claim to have them. We'll hear about these a little bit later. Another friend of White speaks to how wonderful White was, except he lacked moral fiber, and that in his dwellings he would receive only his intimate friends as guests, some of them young girls. The papers talk at length about Harry's activities in the prison. They aren't anything interesting, but the papers fill up a lot of space with the telling. Both sides are gathering up all the witnesses possible. Some will be for the inquest, some will be saved for grand jury, some for the trial itself. Now, this has come up again. In these days, a spouse may not testify against their spouse. So for Evelyn, she could refuse to testify on the grounds of privileged communications between husband and wife. Arraigned before coroner's jury, charged with murder after 3-minute jury deliberation. Grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder. Evelyn refused to answer grand jury questions and was not held for contempt of court, again because she's a spouse. Mr. Alcott said of Evelyn before the grand jury was held. Quote, "She is very anxious to be here, although I have advised her not to come. She wants to sit beside her husband. She thinks that is her proper place. I have made arrangements for her to enter the building as quietly as possible. She has been under a terrible strain, and it will be a hardship for her to be here. She has made up her mind not to answer any questions propounded by the grand jury, but will stand on her rights as a wife. She will not rely on the right to refuse to answer questions because they might tend to incriminate or degrade her, but will only exercise her wifely rights." End quote. New York Tribune, June 29, 1906. Quote, "The calling of Anthony Comstock into the case as president of the Society for the Prevention of Vice," that's crime, "gives a new phase to it. Mr. Comstock, it is understood, has been doing some investigating for Thaw for months, particularly in regard to White and some of his associates. The results of this investigation, it is said, on Mr. Comstock's authority, showed a condition of affairs even more unusual than was expected. Mr. Comstock, seen at his New Jersey home yesterday, talked at length. It was about a year and a half ago that Thaw asked me to make some investigations for him. I found the conditions the most awful and disgusting that have ever been brought to my attention. Since then, Mr. Thaw has consulted with me a number of times, and with the officers of the society. I can say that Mr. Thaw never mentioned the name of any woman connected with him. He was intensely loyal to his wife, and although he never said so, it seemed to me that someone near and dear to him had come under the influence of Mr. White. Mr. Thaw gave me names and addresses in many cases, and we found his stories to be true. But the fear of exposure always prevented anyone from coming forward and prosecuting. Family influence barred our investigations. I feel sure that the opening which this case will give will cause one of the greatest scandals that New York has known in a generation." End quote. Color me intrigued. Oddly, White's autopsy report came out. Not that this ultimately makes any difference, but his physical condition was so poor that he might have died naturally within a year or two. He had Bright's disease, now known as nephritis, incipient tuberculosis, and fatty degeneration of the liver. So, a little more information has come out as to why Harry may have lost his you-know-what and done a killing. According to two men at the Cafe Martin, Stanford, on seeing Evelyn in the restaurant, said, quote, "There's the little Nesbit bleep," and what he continued to say was not fit for print. And if Harry heard this, well, it could have driven him over the edge. According to the Times-Dispatch, June 30th, 1906, quote, "A more vile stigma was never cast upon a woman." And the defense will argue that the words could only have emanated from a hopelessly depraved mind, end quote. That would be Stanford's noggin that they are speaking of. An unnamed lawyer stated, quote, "If murder was ever justified, it was in this case. No husband who is not a poltroon and coward would permit such a remark to go unchallenged. I will go further and declare that had such words been said of my wife, I should have done exactly what Harry Kendall Thaw did. Murder the man who uttered them," end quote. So the newspapers are speculating on all kinds of things. I'm going to try to stick to facts, but if you think 1906 papers were flowering without want of scandal, ha! You would be wrong. The Stone Tablet people probably loved a good scandal written about the couple who lived in the cave around the bend of the mountain. Just saying, scandals are exciting, as long as they aren't about you. Goodwin's Weekly, July 21st, 1906. William Marion Reedy said of the tragedy, quote, "If Stanford White was of evil life, that gave Harry Kendall Thaw no right to kill him. If Evelyn Nesbit still coquetted with White after her marriage to Thaw, that did not license Thaw to murder the architect. If the woman, through vanity, played on Thaw's jealousy with intimation of White's infatuation, she is a double murderess." The big murder case offers very little on which to hang sympathy for any of the parties to the tragedy, although Thaw, the weakling of the trio, was the most the victim of fate. He was destroyed as to character by too much money, inducing idleness. It was money accursed in that it was grafted out of the people by protection. Society wrought a grievous wrong against young Thaw, and he terribly avenged it. Society, too, with its false ideals, ruined the woman and corrupted the abilities of White. We are our brother's keepers, and our sisters too. So, coming squarely down to first principles, who are we that we should punish any of the sinners that we helped to make? End quote. Remember when Norman Bates said that a boy's best friend is his mother? From the Condon Globe, November 9th, 1906. Quote, his mother has ever been devoted to his livelihood, along with the lives of his siblings. As we've seen before with these wealthier families, you have to be careful who you associate with, who you marry, who you divorce. Mrs. Thaw paved the way for her daughter to marry the Earl of Yarmouth, satisfactorily, even with opposition from other family members. Harry comes back from Europe with Evelyn on his arm, already married. Mrs. Thaw prepares a second wedding and takes the couple home with her. Out of the complex love affairs of her children, when all the world scoffed, she has seen what was true and developed successful marriages. End quote. With her other two children, one of whom is married to George Carnegie, she's had less troubles. So Thaw, ticked at being called insane, tossed his former counsel, don't bother asking who they were, just insert lawyer blank, and got new counsel, one Delphin Michael Delmas, Pacific Coast bar lawyer with a great name, the only reason why I'm bothering to say it. Apparently, according to the Long Valley Advocate newspaper, he reminds one in the face of the first Napoleon. Okie doke. Harry's mom wants him judged insane, and her lawyer, Thaw's former lawyer, Alcott, will do everything in his power to try to get appointed a lunacy commission. Rumors have been abound that the Thaws were seeking divorce. When asked, Evelyn said, quote, I wish you would contradict as being absolutely impossible, untrue, and absurd the report that I have ever contemplated or am now contemplating asking for a divorce. There is not a grain of truth in it. I never thought of such a thing, and I have no such idea in view now. End quote. December 18th, 1906. So that horrible thing that Stanford was said to have done to Evelyn, one that Harry will use as defense regarding his actions against Stanford. According to one of the newspapers, Evelyn contracted, quote, an almost incurable disease, positively incurable if not taken in its early stages, from Stanford White, and how Evelyn Nesbit Thaw in turn transmitted the disease to her husband, who has it at the present time, end quote. That is from the Hawaiian Star, December 29th, 1906. Yikes. Apparently, she got this disease 3 years before she married Harry. When she got symptoms, she told Stanford about her issues and that she would expose him as a leper. Stanford gave her money and put her on a boat to Europe for treatment and told her not to tell anyone. The treatment helped, but of course did not cure. Outwardly, she appears to be fine, but the defense lawyers have her blood exams to uphold her defense. So will they have to exhume Stanford's body to prove it all? And I'm assuming this is why she initially didn't want to marry Harry? Evelyn is said to have been ever devoted to Harry since his incarceration. Quote, I know that Harry will be able to prove his right to freedom. With faith in this, I am willing to give up everything and do anything in my power to help him. Yes, I have given up all that meant much to me before, but I am glad to do it. The past life seems like a dream to me. I feel stronger every day because of my regular program. I shall be well able to undergo the hours of Harry's trial. Never fear. End quote. Well, we're approaching the trial. The newspaper full out states the jurors' names, jobs, ages, where they live, if they are married or not, and what number juror they are. Wow. Each juror will get his own guard, who will be constantly with them until the trial is over. And just to put this here as well, the newspaper actually stated when the trial was over how each juror voted, names and everything. Anywho, defense states, quote, the defense will rely upon all defenses which we may be able to prove under the plea of not guilty, that he killed White without malice and without premeditation, and in the belief of self-defense induced by the threats of White to kill the defendant, that he thought he was the agent of Providence, that he had for 3 years been suffering from a disease of the brain, that he did not know that act was wrong, that there was hereditary insanity and epilepsy in the family, end quote. Obviously, Prosecution wants death for Harry. Everyone and their dog knows that Harry killed Stanford. So, 1, the defense doesn't want death, and 2, is it really murder then if he's insane? Or is it self-defense? The state had only 9 witnesses and finished in less than 2 hours. Lawrence, Stanford's son, who spoke of having dinner with his father, and Lawrence's friend at Cafe Martin before he and friend went to a garden, and how when he got back home, he was met by reporters who told him his father had been killed. Warner Paxton, Madison Square Garden engineer who saw Stanford on the roof garden, saw Harry shoot Stanford, saw Harry break down the revolver, and on the way down in the elevator said, quote, "I did it because he ruined my wife," end quote. Assistant DA Garvin, quote, "What did the prisoner's wife say?" End quote. Paxton, quote, "She said yes, but look at the fix you are in now," end quote. And Thaw replied, quote, "All right, dearie, but I probably saved your life." Myra Cohen, similar testimony as Paxton, along with Henry F. Blease and Dr. Marvin Peckner. Paul Brett, fireman who took the gun from Harry. Edward H. Convey, foreman of the garden. Patrolman Debs, who arrested Harry. Cross-examined by Dalmas, who asked and was told by the witnesses that none of them could see White's left hand, which will be used to say that Harry thought that Stanford was carrying lead. Thaw's will, which he had at the time of his marriage, was discussed. Why? Because he's still alive, right? Well, yes, but in that will from April 1905, he had a codicil to the will which provided that $7,500 be set aside for the prosecution of Mr. White and another man, in connection with the mistreatment of certain young women. He also willed $2,500 each to 4 men to be used to help prosecute Stanford. And so Gleason, with the defense, lays out their case, stating that there is not just one defense, but many. That Harry acted without malice and without premeditation and in the belief of self-defense. That Harry had, for 3 years, suffered from a disease of the brain which culminated in shooting Stanford. After the murder, Harry was not aware of his mental condition and declared himself sane. Gleason said, quote, "The defendant killed Stanford White because he did not know that the act was wrong." Now, what was the cause of this mental condition of the brain? Hereditary insanity in the family. We will show you, gentlemen, that in this man's family, to a marked extent, there were insanity and epilepsy. We will show you this man's temperament, in which were the seeds of insanity implanted that were liable to spring up. We will prove to you that this man was born with what the physicians call a psychopathic temperament. That is to say, a temperament liable to a mind disease, what we would call in our general way a highly nervous temperament, end quote. March 5th, 1907. Dr. Britton Evans, defense alienist. Mr. Jerome, DA, asked, quote, "When the fireman took the weapon from Thaw and asked him why he killed White, and he said, 'Because he ruined my wife,' was that a sign of insanity?" End quote. Dr. Evans responded, quote, "It shows that he had one thought that weighed down on him for some time and was still on his mind," end quote. We've got people testifying that Harry is not rational, others that he appears rational. A scandalous affidavit allegedly written by Evelyn about some extremely horrific abuse she suffered at Harry's hands while they were in Europe. But others claim that this affidavit was falsified by a lawyer who openly claimed not to be Evelyn's lawyer, but had to have been if this affidavit is true. A lunacy commission to determine Harry's sanity or insanity has been called. The commissioner's report found that Harry was indeed sane enough to be tried for White's murder. In closing, Mr. Dalmas, Harry's attorney, quote, "I shall not appeal to any such shadowy, unsubstantial thing as the so-called unwritten law, but shall depend upon the law of the state, in which there is ample protection for this defendant," end quote. He went on to heavily denounce Evelyn's mom for selling Evelyn off to White, basically. He denounced the prosecution. He denounced the lawyer who allegedly made up the affidavit. Anyway, DA Jerome said, quote, "We have heard much of dementia Americana, but this dementia Americana doesn't wait 3 years before it strikes down a seducer, and then only after waiting until it had a good dinner. Dementia Americana doesn't flaunt an unfortunate girl for 2 years as its mistress. Dementia Americana doesn't take refuge in the terrible confession of a poor girl forced to tell her shame upon the stand. No, gentlemen, the dementia Americana that moves men to strike for their homes and their women is not that kind. Why did he wait 3 long years? Why, if he was insane all that time, did he wait so long before killing White? He killed White because he feared White would again take the girl from him. End quote. And then with regards to the horrific things White was alleged to have done to Evelyn, quote, and then the defense ostentatiously put in evidence a big bunch of letters from Stanford White to the girl. Were they read? Only one of them. Do you think that if there had been the least suggestion of anything evil in any of those letters, they would not have been read? And wouldn't a man, if he had the character the defense ascribes to him, have written something evil? They were not read because there was not a word in them that was not proper and kindly. End quote. And he points out that she continued to meet White again and again. While the jury were out deliberating, here is a conversation caught in the hallway sometime later between D.A. Jerome and Harry's attorney, Delmas, on opposite sides of the courtroom, but with the same opinion on food. Jerome, quote, there's my learned friend now. I'm just going out to get something to eat. I've been living on raw eggs all day, end quote. Delmas, quote, I made my speech with a foundation of toast and coffee for breakfast and had no lunch, end quote. Jerome, well, I'm going to have a good dinner anyhow. Delmas, I'm going for a Turkish bath. Well, what the heart wants, the heart wants. April 13th, 1907. So, what happened? Mistrial. Jury could not come to an agreement. They had it out for about 48 hours and finally told Justice Fitzgerald that it wasn't going to happen. The jury was 7-5 in favor of murder verdict in the first degree. This means we're likely going to have trial number 2. So that ends part 1. This Thaw story ain't over by a long shot. I'll be back next week for part 2. Hope to see you.